we learn how we should report adverse event, how we should manage serious adverse event during clinical trial. And for that, we are really privileged to have with us Professor Avijit Hazra, sir. Again, Professor Avijit Hazra, sir, needs no introduction. Sir is a very senior professor in the field of pharmacology. Currently, sir is the dean at the prestigious institute, SSKM Hospital and IPGMER. So, welcome, sir. Welcome, Professor Avijit Hazra, sir. Now, stage is yours, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Shambho. Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So, at the outset, let me thank Apicon for giving me this opportunity of being with you this afternoon and sharing some of my experience related to adverse event monitoring and management in clinical trials. Now, since morning, you have been listening to different aspects of good clinical practice, and clearly you must agree that looking at drugs, their effectiveness and efficacy without considering their safety aspects would be clearly unethical and unacceptable from any point of view. So a whole gamut of responsibilities and a whole gamut of activities surround this issue of patient safety in the context of clinical trials. And that would be my subject of my presentation for the next 20 or 25 minutes. Let me share the slides. Are my slides visible?
Yes, sir. Sir, please make it full screen, sir. Yeah.
It's full screen at my end.
Okay, sir. I think then you have to stop screen sharing. Again, start screen
I'll
sharing.
Try again. I'll try again. Just give me a second. Is it full screen?
I think it is coming, sir. No. Please reshare, sir.
Can you see my slides full screen?
Yes. Yes. Now it's full screen, sir.
Okay. Okay. So safety reporting in clinical trials. And as we just now said, that clinical research without ensuring patient safety is unethical. And if you look at the entire philosophy of ethics behind clinical trials, as epitomized by the essence of the Nuremberg Code of 1947, science cannot be above human safety. Whatever may have been the prevailing historical notions regarding the importance of science, we now clearly understand that individual subjects will always outweigh the importance of science. Now, in the context of clinical trials, we have four major stakeholders. We have the investigators, we have the sponsors, we have the ethics committees. In our context, it is mostly institutional ethics committees. And also we have the drug regulatory agencies in any country or territory. So all of them are the major stakeholders in clinical trials, and all of them have their responsibilities. Nowadays, these are quite well defined in the context of ensuring patient safety. Now, safety monitoring of drugs or even other objects which go into clinical trials, for instance, medical devices, last in all phases of clinical trials. With regard to drugs, we know that drug development, the clinical phase is structured into phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Following phase 3, there may be marketing of the molecule. And finally, there would be post-marketing studies may be conducted. And in all these cases, safety would be an important endpoint. It is only that the focus of safety might change. For instance, you know that in phase 1 trial, mostly the drugs are being tested upon healthy volunteers, not even patients. So the focus there is mainly safety. We are not looking into the efficacy of the drugs. In phase 2, we test the drug upon patients, and here also the prime focus is safety. In addition to safety, we try to look at the pharmacokinetics of the drug and to some extent the effectiveness of the drug. In phase 3, now the effectiveness question gets a lot of traction, and we look at the effectiveness of the drug in comparison to either a placebo or an active comparator. But there are a number of safety goals in phase 3 studies. For instance, we try to identify the common adverse effects, as well as try to see the less common adverse effects, because the number of volunteers in phase 3 studies extend up to a few thousands. We also try to quantify the common adverse effects, and we try to see that in what context, in the context of the patient's clinical condition, these adverse effects are happening, and the information is shared. If these adverse effects happen to be serious, these are shared between all the trial sites. Phase 4 may be looking at effectiveness questions, but we can also do exclusively safety-focused phase 4 studies.
Sorry to interrupt, sir. Slides are not moving.
Slides are not moving?
No, sir. Yes, now it's moving. Okay.
No, I'm in this slide for some time.
Okay, sir.
So as you can see that right from bench top to bedside, safety issue is paramount, and safety issue is a must. Safety endpoints are a must in all phases or all stages of clinical trials. So although we place a lot of emphasis upon safety, we have to remember that safety issues have the potential to stop a trial, or even after all the testing has been completed, the trials have been completed, data have been submitted to regulatory authority. The regulatory authority may find the safety signals unacceptable, which would render the drug unapprovable. And the worst case scenario is that the drug is introduced into the market, but then serious safety issues are discovered, and this triggers the requirement of a risk management program, which is damaging to regulators, to consumers, to prescribers, and of course to the marketing authorization holders. We have quite a few examples in the recent past, Rofecoxib being a major example where withdrawal and risk management program was needed. So safety is not just additional data points. These are real scientific issues. These are emotive issues, and they can also be the reason for loss of goodwill in society or in the community. So we'll not go into this again. Safety issues are there in all aspects of the trial, but the focus changes. Now we need to understand a few terminologies related to safety monitoring in clinical trials. We begin with this: adverse drug reaction. WHO, as well as International Council for Harmonization, defines an adverse drug reaction as response to a drug which is noxious and unintended, and which occurs at doses normally used in man for the prophylaxis, diagnosis, or therapy of diseases, or for the modification of physiological function. So this definition is allied with the WHO definition of drugs. So it refers to effects which are noxious. Noxious means harmful or potentially harmful, and which are unintended. They may not be unexpected. If we are prescribing a benzodiazepine-like molecule to somebody as a sedative, we know that there might be daytime drowsiness the next morning. But our intention was to give the patient a good night's sleep, not to cause daytime drowsiness. So these are effects which would be noxious and unintended, and you can see a few words underlined. So at doses normally used in man. In other words, these are effects which are noxious, which would be encountered in the normally recommended doses. Now, if you think about this definition a little bit, you'll understand that this definition applies to products which are already in the market. Why? Because it is only for marketed products where you'll get recommended doses in the prescribing literature. But what about medicines which are in development, which are yet to be marketed? Because we do not know the recommended doses, this definition will strictly not apply. So for this, there is an alternative definition that all noxious and unintended responses to a medicinal product related to any drug, any dose of the drug, can be considered as an adverse drug reaction. So in the context of the clinical trial, we interpret any adverse effect, any adverse experience as a potential adverse drug reaction, or what we say in India, a suspected adverse drug reaction. In the pre-approval stage of a new product or its new usage, the therapeutic dosage may not be established. Now, we are also using a term adverse event, which differs a little bit from an adverse drug reaction. An adverse event refers to any untoward medical occurrence in a patient or clinical investigation subject administered a pharmaceutical product, which does not necessarily have a causal relationship with this treatment. So let me clarify with a small example. Let us say a patient is taking a medicine. The patient walks out of his front door, let's say gets knocked down by a motorbike, fracture both bones leg, hospitalized. So what would you call this event? This event is definitely noxious or harmful. But is it an accident or is it a drug reaction? Now, going by the common thread of things, you'll generally think this is an accident. The way they drive two-wheelers these days on Indian roads, anybody can have this type of accident. But then if you probe the issue a little further, let us say you look at the drug which the person has been taking, and you realize that the drug is an H1 antihistamine, which has been given as an anti-allergic medication. Now, we know that most H1 antihistamines, they will cross the blood-brain barrier. They will cause sedation. They will cause drowsiness. Even if they do not cause frank drowsiness, the reaction time would be affected. So the subject would be less alert. And maybe in this case, this reduced alertness led to that accident. So it is not that the drug slowly caused the accident. The rash motorbike was also involved, but the drug was definitely a contributory factor and could have a causal relationship to this accident. So we reserve the term adverse event when we have not yet probed the possible causal relationship, and we use the term adverse drug reaction or suspected adverse drug reaction when we have a reasonable suspicion that the event might be linked to the drug in question. Now, in clinical trials, we can consider any unfavorable or unintended symptom or sign, any allergic reaction, or even a totally asymptomatic finding which we are noticing on biochemical tests or imaging investigations as adverse event. So we know that statins may cause elevation of liver enzymes, but the patient may be asymptomatic. Some drugs may cause pulmonary fibrosis, but these might not cause symptoms for a very long time. So even such asymptomatic things can be categorized as adverse events. And once we have probed the relationship to the drug in question, then we can also recategorize them as suspected adverse drug reactions. Now, there are various ways of categorizing adverse events, and we need to know about some of them. For instance, we can categorize adverse events by severity, and we commonly refer to an event as mild, moderate, or severe. Is there any watertight definition between these terms? No, but there are some working interpretations. So what is this like? We'll say an event is mild if it does not disrupt your daily routine, it does not require withdrawal of the drug or dose modification of the drug, and it does not call for specific remedial treatment. If any of these three conditions are violated, then we can consider the event as severe, and something that falls in between where these criteria are not violated in the sense, but you may prefer to disrupt your daily routine and take some rest because you're not feeling comfortable. That may categorize as a moderate event. So as against severity, we have a statutory definition of the term seriousness. So an event, a drug-related event, can be serious or non-serious. And in India, the Schedule Y, the erstwhile Schedule Y of the Drugs and Cosmetics Rules of 1945, first defined a serious adverse event. And this was in sync with definitions prevailing in other countries, innovator countries. Schedule Y said that an untoward medical occurrence during a clinical trial that would be associated or that may lead to death of the subject or may lead to hospitalization of the subject, or if the patient is already in hospital, then it would lead to prolongation of hospitalization, or that which causes a persistent or significant disability or incapacity. The term incapacity is used in a temporary sense and disability is used in a more permanent sense. Or an event that is a congenital anomaly or birth defect, or any event that is potentially life-threatening, but the subject is rescued by timely medical intervention, that can be regarded as a serious adverse event, or what we now popularly know as SAEs. Remember, SAEs are not severe adverse events, rather they are serious adverse events. And if we look at the relationship of seriousness with severity, we realize that most serious adverse events are also likely to be severe, but not all severe adverse events are likely to be serious. Okay, so it depends upon the criteria by which we use seriousness, and this is an important definition because the issue of medical negligence, the issue of compensation would be linked to seriousness rather than the severity of the event. So it may happen that we are using an antibiotic, which may be an aminoglycoside, which can lead to mild hearing loss. So high frequency tones are affected. The normal conversation is not affected, but only the person is unable to perceive the high frequency sound. So he does not appear to be disabled in day-to-day life, but suppose he was a musician, or suppose he has to hear high-pitched sounds to make certain in his work, then that might be affecting him, might be affecting his activities. So although the event may be mild, it would be called serious because it has led to permanent disability. So severity and seriousness. Then expectedness. How do we say that an event is expected or when the event is non-expected? We'll say that event is expected if that event is already reported in reference safety information. It has been reported earlier. If not, we'll consider the event as unexpected. So what do we mean by reference safety information? For drugs already in the market, they will have their detailed prescribing information, or which is known as summary of product characteristics in some countries. So if we look at the prescribing literature, and if we find that event already listed, then that is an expected event. For drugs in development, all principal investigators are provided with an investigator's brochure by the sponsor. So this is a compendium of information related to the drug for all phases of development up to the current one. And if the event is documented there, then also it becomes an expected event. But if you don't find the event in the prescribing literature or in the investigator's brochure, then that event is known as unexpected. And if you look at the title of the slide, there is a term called SUSA, Suspected Unexpected Serious Adverse Drug Reaction. Now, this is something which all sponsors, all pharmaceutical companies who are into drug development are very much afraid of. So you are doing a trial, you encounter a SUSAR, let's say hepatotoxicity in one center. Fine, you become cautious. Then another site reports another incidence of hepatotoxicity. And by law, you have to share all these SAE reports with all the other centers. So 2 reports, 3 reports, the alarm bells start ringing. And if more than that, then the sponsor would be in a fix. And in most instances, the sponsor may decide that there is no point continuing with the development of the drug further, because a drug which causes serious hepatotoxicity is unlikely to be regarded as safe, and it may be unapprovable, or worse, it may have to be withdrawn from the market after launch. So remember this term SUSAR in addition to the term SAE. Now, whenever we, one more term I'll just say, the last categorization of adverse event is about the causal relationship between the event and the drug in question. Now, biologically determining causality is a very difficult issue. We know that in pharmacovigilance, we have different causality assessment criteria. For instance, we have the Naranjo's algorithm, the WHO Uppsala Monitoring Center criteria, by which we try to infer causality, but it is at best an imperfect science, and it is very difficult, unless you have a huge number of temporally associated reports, to say with certainty that a drug is indeed the main culprit or the sole culprit behind an adverse event. But so far as working definitions are concerned, we need not be 100% sure before we can call a drug related by causality. If there is reasonable suspicion, if there is some biological plausibility that the drug may have led to the event, then we can say that the event is related. But if there is absolutely no such possibility, there is biological plausibility also does not exist. There is no temporal relationship. Okay, no de-challenge, re-challenge positive information, then we can perhaps say that the event in question is unrelated to the drug. So in the context of clinical trials in India as well as in other countries, whenever an SAE is encountered, then that SAE must be reported. And the reporting elements are fixed. In India, the first such, I might say, the schedule or pro forma for reporting was provided by Appendix 11 of Schedule Y. Now, the earlier Schedule Y has now been repealed, and things have been incorporated into the new drugs and clinical trial rules. So there are certain set criteria or set information which have to be reported. And how do we pick up SAEs? We don't need to do anything special. We have to stick to the study protocol, ensure that all the protocol specified tests or biomarkers, whatever they are being followed up properly, and patients are being followed up properly. They are coming at the scheduled visits. We need to be vigilant. We don't need to do something extra special. And if, despite all our precautions, SAEs do occur, then we have to report them in the specific format. Now, in India, over time, a lot of important changes occur. And one of the most important changes was introduction of Rule 122 DAB in our Drugs and Cosmetic Rules of 1945. So this was the first time that a compensation clause was incorporated in law, and which said that in the event of clinical trial related death or other types of injury, then the participant is entitled to some compensation. Of course, these have now been incorporated into our new drugs and clinical trial rules. And I'm not going into reading out the lines on the slide, but suffice it to say that the participant is entitled to 2 types of compensation. One is compensation for medical management of the events which ultimately led to the death, or the medical management if the patient did not die. And this compensation will have to be paid at actuals. Whatever the patients or their family members, whatever expenses they incurred, these have to be reimbursed at actuals. The second part of the compensation which is available to the participant by virtue of the fact that he or she participated in the study, regardless of how long the participation was or in what arm of the study the participant was, or what kind of initial health condition the participant had. they are entitled to the compensation if it can be established that the event in question is related to the suspected drug. If this relatedness is not there, then the participant is not eligible for the second part of the compensation. Now, the compensation money comes from the sponsor, and to ensure that the sponsor has enough money to pay the compensation, Indian law now says that all sponsored clinical trials must incorporate an element of insurance to pay compensation for medical trial related injury or death. And in case of failure to provide medical management or the cost of medical management or compensation, the regulatory body has the power to cancel that particular clinical trial or to suspend the trial or even restrict the sponsor from conducting future clinical trials. So in our regulatory level, we had a number of new drug advisory committees addressed to different therapeutic areas. Now, the names of these committees have been changed and they're now called subject expert committees. They are made up of experts already present in the regulatory body as well as experts invited from medical and research institutions all across the country. So they advise on the acceptability of new drug applications, and also the added responsibility is to opine on the relatedness and the eligibility for compensation in case of SAE. So all SAEs in all kinds of clinical trials, never mind whether it is a phase 1 study or phase 4 study, whether it is being conducted by a large multinational company or a small agency, all SAEs need to be reported to the regulator, and the regulator will channel it to the appropriate subject expert committee for further review. Okay, so instead of going through this slide, let me summarize the whole scenario in terms of this flowchart. So in India, it is said that whenever an SAE occurs, within 24 hours of occurrence, the principal investigator, the PI, must report this SAE. Where will they report? They will report to the sponsor, they will report to the institutional ethics committee, and they will report to the regulatory authority, that is our Drugs Controller General of India. So this must be within 24 hours of occurrence. If the PI gets to know of the event later, when 24 hours has already elapsed, then within 24 hours of PI getting to know of the event, the initial report has to be there. And this initial report has to be followed up by a more detailed report within 14 calendar days after further analysis and after adding some more information. Remember, these are calendar days. Okay. It doesn't matter whether we have weekends in between or public holidays in between. The sponsor and the investigator will frame a joint report, a more detailed report than the initial report, and then they will submit the report. They will submit it to the head of the site, head of the institution. They will submit it to the regulator, and the regulator will pass it on to the chairperson of the subject expert committee, and they will also report to the institutional ethics committee chairperson. Now, the ethics committee, once it receives the report, it receives two reports, the initial report as well as the more detailed follow-up report within 14 days, has 30 days, 30 calendar days to analyze and give its opinion regarding the event. Now, there are certain set criteria on which that opinion has to be expressed. For instance, the ethics committee has to opine whether informed consent was duly taken, whether appropriate medical management was provided and there was no medical negligence involved, what was the subject's general health condition or state at the time of recruitment in the study, whether the subject was followed up as per protocol or whether protocol violations occurred, and finally, and most important, what the ethics committee feel, whether there is a relatedness between the drug and the event. Now, at the regulator level, the opinion of the ethics committee is given considerable importance. And if the ethics committee says that the event is related, it is very unlikely that the subject expert committee or the Drugs Controller General of India would overrule this conclusion. Now, once the ethics committee's report is submitted, the regulator has 90 days to interact with the subject expert committee and give its order. order for compensation if that is applicable. Remember, the compensation for medical management is always there. The second part of the compensation depends upon the relatedness of the event. And once that order is passed, the sponsor or the applicant for the drug, they have 30 days to execute that compensation order and pay the compensation to either the patient or their family members. Now, since the identity of the patient and the family members are confidential, everything has to be routed through the PI. So earlier, one of the responsibilities given to the ethics committee was to calculate the quantum of this compensation. But this is a difficult process, and fortunately, this problem has been solved. The government has decided a formula based upon the Workmen's Compensation Act, and which is now provided in 7th schedule of the New Drugs and Clinical Trial Rules of 2019. So the largest amount of compensation is available for death, and for other kinds of clinical trial related injury, there are different slabs or bands of compensation. So remember that if you are conducting a clinical trial, patient safety and monitoring of adverse drug events is both your scientific and ethical responsibility. You have to be vigilant. You don't have to do anything special. You have to follow the protocol and be vigilant so that you are able to detect and report adverse drug reactions. And if these are serious adverse events, then you have to follow the reporting procedures and timelines as provided in the guidelines and the law of the land. So, dear friends, this is all from me today, and I'm sure that there would be questions on safety reporting and safety monitoring in clinical trials, but maybe that can be taken up during the panel discussion. So thank you from my side for the moment. I'll stop sharing, and it's over to Dr. Shambhu.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for this very simple explanation of this very critical topic. And I think we will take questions on this subject at the time of panel discussion.